The Suzhou Circus has been held at the tourist park in Sichuan County, China for decades. It is a popular attraction for tourists and the Chinese alike. The place is filled with acrobats performing amazing feats, rides, food, arcade games, and more events than anyone could fit into a single day. But on this day, the circus was closed off from the public. The staff were still reeling from a terrible loss earlier that week. One of their most experienced trapeze artists, Sun, and her husband Zhang were performing one of their daring stunts in front of a crowd of hundreds of people when Sun fell to her death. The whole ordeal was caught by the many cell phones that were recording the spectacular feats of the circus. Zhang was now with his relatives arranging his wife's funeral, while his colleagues at the circus mourned their beloved friend's death. To say that the staff were on edge would be an understatement. Not only were they all in the throes of despair, but many of them had witnessed the incident themselves, and there was more than one member of the team dealing with trauma from the experience. But to make matters worse, the entire circus was under investigation. The constant presence of authorities and the hours of grueling interrogations that they were being put through were weighing heavily on every single member of the Suzhou team. The men and women tried their best to keep up with their daily training, making repairs to rides, and maintaining the animals in their care. Anything to keep their minds off everything that was going on. 2 days after the incident, on May 25, 2021, the team rose at 5 in the morning like they did every morning. And like always, they met up at the main gates and waited for their manager to give out the assignments for the day. Even if they were closed down while the investigation went on, there was still plenty to do. Feeding and cleaning up after the many animals the circus kept would take them most of the morning. They had monkeys, tigers, elephants, lions, bears, and pythons, not to mention goats and rabbits in the petting zoo section of the park. The bigger animals and the monkeys were strictly trained to perform all sorts of amazing feats of obedience and remarkable tricks for the public. And even the reptiles had their own exhibitions. Not only were the animals all hungry, but their cages and holdings all needed maintenance, so the team was split in two. The first group would go in to feed and water every creature, followed by a second team with their toolboxes, who would then proceed to start oiling the hinges, relining the fences, and servicing any other part of the holdings that the animals were kept in. The second group would be able to move more freely once the carnivores were properly fed. Big cats become incredibly lazy once they've had something to eat, and even though they were all well trained and their handlers kept close by at all times, these were still wild animals, and they could be unpredictable even under the best of circumstances. Starting with the petting zoo, they moved along slowly, each animal getting bigger and bigger as they moved deeper into the park. After the petting zoo, the heavy wire gate was pulled shut behind the team, carrying wheelbarrows full of meat and feed bags. Every section of the park had this safety precaution in place. In the event that an animal did manage to slip past a handler, at least they'd be contained in the square dedicated to their holdings. Next were the buildings that held the glass tanks with snakes and lizards. After them were the monkeys and African bucks. Then came the lions, and after them came the bears. The two last members of the animal performers were the Siberian tigers and, finally, the elephants. The mistake that led to the terrible events of that day happened when the team of 6, equipped with large hunks of meat in wheelbarrows, entered the tiger enclosure. The fenced area that held the 4 magnificent creatures was high and sturdy. A single gate, with only a slip-bolt action needed to open it, and no lock to secure it from intruders, stood between the people and the animals. Tigers don't have opposable thumbs, so opening a slip bolt would be virtually impossible. 2 members of the team opened the gate and started tossing the chunks of goat meat onto the grassy floor of the cage, which measured almost 10 meters in circumference. The cats did not excitedly run to the food like the other animals did. Instead, they watched the group intently, waiting for them to leave before they went forward to eat. The big cats are observant, much more so than humans give them credit for. Two of the creatures noticed that the last man to leave was not looking down at his hands when he pulled the bolt shut. The metallic bar missed the hole by a few centimeters and instead pulled out into empty air. The gate looked shut to the distracted keepers, but just a small gust of wind would be enough to swing it wide open. Two of the predators went forward to eat their share of their food, but the other two, who had noticed the crew's mistake, remained laying in the grass where they were. They knew from years of habit and schedule that the humans would go to the elephants next, only to return a few minutes later. After they passed, the tigers would be left alone for the rest of the morning, and sure enough, 6 men and women walked back past them less than 10 minutes later. When the 6 staff members were finally done feeding every animal all the way to the end of the massive property, the maintenance team arrived. As the felines moved toward the gate, the bravest of the two, a 4-year-old male, started to nervously sniff at the gate, but he backed off when the separating gate a few feet away swung open and 3 men stepped in, carrying their toolboxes and cans of lubricating oil. Momentarily confused about this break in the usual schedule, the two stepped back and took in the scene before they decided to act. The men paid the tigers no mind. They were heading toward the elephants at the back. Yang Yai, a 51-year-old man who had been working for the circus for over 20 years, was one of the 3 men that walked in that fateful day. He carried a toolbox in one hand, and he was lighting a cigarette with the other. He was fumbling to get his lighter back in his pocket as he was walking when he dropped the case. His tools spread across the cobblestoned walkway, and he swore loudly. His colleagues laughed good-naturedly at his blunder, and he waved them away, telling them that he'd catch up once he got all of his tools picked up. Meanwhile, the 2 tigers were watching the scene intently. They saw the 2 men walk through the next gate, leaving one behind. The man was bent over, his back facing the felines. The brave male inched forward, reaching out its paw. The gate swung open smoothly and silently at its touch. Yang did not hear a thing behind him as he puffed on his cigarette. He threw the fallen tools back into the case with so many clangs and bangs that he wouldn't have heard the gate even if it did let out a warning squeak. Slowly, the male crept forward, the older female right behind him. Both of them were low to the ground, their shoulders shimmying as they stalked the oblivious man. Neither of them had ever set foot in the wild in their entire lives, but instinct told their hungry bellies exactly what to do. They came closer and closer. Just then, one of Yang's companions looked over his shoulder, through the gate that separated them from the tiger holding. Immediately, he started screaming at Yang when he saw the stalking cats just a few feet behind him. Yang's head snapped back just as the male leaped through the air, its nails drawn at its mouth open wide. Without missing a beat, Yang whipped the hammer in his hand around. He hit the beast's claws so hard that its entire body was thrown off course. Spinning like some bizarre screeching doll, the animal crashed to the ground. But it barely hit the earth when the female behind it sprang into action herself. She launched herself at Yang, and this time he wasn't as quick as before. Yang was crouched on the ground as the animal landed on him from above. She sank her claws into his skull and shoulder, her teeth biting down right into his face. Now Yang was screaming, wildly swinging the hammer, desperate to hit some part of the ferociously clawing and biting creature. The men behind him were trapped behind the fence. If they dared open the gate, they'd have all 4 tigers on top of them. They called in for help over the radio, screaming so hysterically that the rest of the team could only make out that there were tigers loose. Every inhabitant of the park ran to the enclosure, and the police, who had just arrived for that day's set of interviews, were right behind them with their guns drawn. The situation with Yang had deteriorated drastically in the seconds it took to radio for help. The tiger was still pinned to his face, and the young male had regained its footing. It jumped back into the attack, grabbing hold of one of Yang's flailing legs. In a macabre tug-of-war, the tigers pulled and tore at the screaming man. The female's claws sliced into muscle and flesh, tearing away at the skin on his shoulder. Her other paw wrapped around his forehead, and one of her claws found an eye socket and tore his eyeball clear out of his skull, partially scalping him in the process. That's when Yang blacked out. The combination of blood loss, shock, pain, and pure terror was just too much for his system to deal with. And when his body went limp, the pair of wild animals continued to rip and tear at him with renewed urgency. When the police and the rest of the circus employees arrived at the gate, the lions and bears behind them were beating against their cages, roaring and bawling. The iron stench of blood in the air had them all in a frenzy. The police pushed the staff members aside. The situation was crystal clear. Not only was the man dead, but the remaining 2 maintenance men were trapped behind a thin wire barrier close by. The blood-crazed cats could easily scale the fences on either side. They could attack the trapped men or the staff on the opposite side, depending on which fence they scaled. The decision was made without saying a word to each other. The 5 officers raised their weapons, and the sound of gunfire rang through the circus. No fewer than 4 bullets hit the female, while the male took 6 shots. Their bodies flew back from the onslaught of firepower, and in an instant, the 2 approaching beasts behind them fled back into their cage, leaving the attackers and Yang on the cobblestones behind them. While they still had the upper hand, the officers breached the gate and slammed the 2 living tigers shut in their cage. Miraculously, the female tiger was still breathing, twitching horribly where she lay, but an officer quickly put her out of her misery with a single shot to the head. The 2 trapped men were led out, right past the remains of their friend and colleague, and the mortician was brought in to remove both Yang and his attackers. After 2 days within days of each other, the Suzhou Circus and all of its exhibitions were emptied in less than a week. The animals have been rehoused in various reserves and parks across China, and they will never see the circus again. Huntingdonshire, England, is the last place that you'd think of to find exotic animals like cheetahs, tigers, monkeys, and raccoons. But Hamerton Zoo Park's been operational since 1990. When Rosa King first showed an interest in the animal kingdom when she was a little girl, this was the closest place her mother could find to satiate the girl's hunger for knowledge. And that was the start of a budding career for Rosa. Every holiday, she'd beg her mother to take her back. And when she got older, Rosa would save up her allowance and take the train to Huntingdonshire to stare through the glass enclosures and walk by the fenced housing a dozen times in a single day. Predictably, Rosa studied zoology, and by the time she was hired as a zookeeper at Hamerton Zoo Park, the staff already knew her by name. It didn't even feel like starting a new job. Rosa just slipped in, like she was part of the family already. And that's where she worked for the next 13 years, while she continued to rack up the degrees and diplomas in her field in her spare time. In 2014, Rosa spent 2 years redesigning the larger animals' enclosures. She spearheaded the project, her heart set on making the animals' living spaces as large and interactive as the grounds could possibly hold, and to engineer a system that was as safe as it could possibly be made for the human handlers that cared for the sometimes ferocious creatures that they loved so much. Rosa's ingenuity created a smart system of gates that allowed animals to eat in a separate enclosure built into their cages. When the gate closed behind the animal, who was happily gobbling down a meal, zookeepers could safely enter the cage to clean, maintain, and drop off toys and other odds and ends needed for that particular day. Rosa's new system was so effective that it has since been adopted by almost every zoo and park meant for viewing across the globe. In May of 2017, 2 years after the zoo's new cage system was implemented, Rosa and the team received a litter of African serval cat kittens. The rescue litter required round-the-clock care, and Rosa was putting in nights to ensure that the kittens were fed and cared for until they became old enough to be released into their new home. Rosa and 2 of her colleagues started at 9 in the evening after closing time and the evening rounds were done. They kept the kittens under observation, feeding them every 2 hours, and at 6 the next morning, they'd start the morning rounds before opening time. When the morning staff arrived to open for the day, whoever was on call that night would finally be relieved, and they'd go home to get some rest, only to do it all over again that evening. On the 19th of March, Rosa handed off the new babies off to the vet, and she and her two colleagues, Jeffrey and David, set out to feed and do a quick cleanup before the rest arrived to relieve them. Jeff and David went ahead, leading the big cats into their top-notch feeding booths, while Rosa came from the rear to clean out the water troughs. Jeff deposited chunks of steak into Sissip, the Malaysian tiger's food tray, kicking the latch door closed behind him as the tiger entered its safe holding. But Jeff's eyes were not on the door, and he only heard the telltale metallic clang behind him and assumed that it snapped shut, like it always did. But that latch never truly snapped closed. The gate just swung back lazily as the tiger inside was still preoccupied with its food, standing wide open as he left and locked the main gate behind him. 15 minutes after Jeff left, and Sissip had devoured every last scrap in his bowl, the tiger turned back through the open door behind him and went back to lying behind a low wall to laze away his full belly. That's when he heard the squeak of the main gate open. It was Rosa, carrying a bucket full of soapy water, some sponges, and a handheld broom. Fully expecting Sissip to be locked safely away with its food to occupy him, she went about cleaning the viewing window from the inside so that the visitors could get a crystal clear look inside the holding when they started to arrive in the next hour. At first, the creature was a little startled and mostly curious. He was never allowed to be in such close proximity to the living humans that came and went. He simply watched the 33-year-old slowly inching closer to her turned back. It took only minutes for him to go from curious onlooker to full-on stalker. Sissip was every bit a hunter. Life in captivity couldn't change that ingrained natural instinct. He smelled Rosa's heat, her blood, her life. Even if his stomach was full, he couldn't pass up what could be the only opportunity he'd ever get to hunt like his kind were born to do. He crept closer slowly until he was only 7 feet away from the woman, with his chest almost level to the ground, ready to pounce any moment. Rosa, still oblivious to the salivating creature behind her, caught something that made her blood run cold. In her peripheral vision, she happened to catch the open gate. Even as her head turned to look at the gate, her feet already started moving toward the exit. She knew better than anyone that that open door meant that the tiger had long since realized that it was in the cage with her. She didn't need to look back for it to know that Sissip was behind her. But her sudden movement was all that Sissip needed to finally act. It took him just one leap to land right on top of her. Rosa folded under the beast's 200 pounds like a marionette. In one smooth motion he pounced, landed, and sank his teeth around Rosa's neck, cutting off all chances of her ever uttering out a scream for help. The canine's teeth bore into her throat, cutting off all oxygen. The pain of those teeth tearing through her flesh was quadrupled by her lungs screaming for air and the immense pressure that pounded against her skull and twanged her ears shut. Rosa's body was pinned face down on the concrete. All she could do was to desperately claw at the ground in front of her as the tiger on top of her used its weight to keep her in place. Sissip had no plans to tear or shake her. He knew full well that he had his prey exactly where he needed. As long as he stayed in place and kept applying pressure, he'd render her unconscious in no time. But Rosa, with one final spurt of survival desperation, got her hands beneath her and she pushed with all her might. Miraculously, Sissip was taken off guard and nearly lost his grip, tearing Rosa's jugular clean out. He reared back, grabbed her again, and this time he shook her to get her off her hands and knees. With a sickening snap, Rosa's spinal cord dislodged from the base of her skull, and she died instantly before loss of blood and oxygen could render her unconscious. For the next hour, while Jeff and David finished their rounds and the main gates opened to receive the first visitors of the day, Sissip toyed with the corpse of his victim. The animal had no urgency to consume Rosa, since he'd just eaten breakfast. But like his initial stalking of her, he was driven more by curiosity and instinct than any real hunger. It wasn't until the first visitor, a retired man out for a morning stroll, looked through the viewing glass that anyone even knew that Rosa was missing. He saw a pool of blood the overturned bucket and sponges, and a heap of bloody rags that used to be Rosa's shirt. The man immediately went out to locate a staff member, being careful not to raise the alarm to the other visitors. His thoughtful discretion is what gave the employees the opportunity to remove the early arrivals without causing a panic. When the security guard, who the man found, first saw the bloody scene, emergency services were called even before anyone attempted to enter the cage. Staff members managed to coax Sissip into his side holding before the ambulance, police, and even a helicopter arrived. But they knew, judging by Sissip's blood-stained muzzle, what the outcome would be. They found Rosa, her torso and face barely recognizable, with her left leg almost severed from her body. Both of her arms were found several feet away, tucked under a bush. The zoo closed for the week to investigate the scene, to determine whether or not Rosa's ingenious snap-lock gate system was at fault. But the authorities came to the conclusion that Rosa's design was indeed every bit as amazing as the park claimed it was. Jeffrey admitted that he was probably to blame for not checking to see if it had closed behind him. But even though it was declared an accident and he faced no charges for the tragic loss because of his negligence, he just couldn't stand staying at the park. He resigned a day before Rosa's funeral. The last time he set foot inside Hamerton Zoo was for Rosa's wake. That Hamerton and Rosa's mother insisted was the proper place for everyone to say their goodbyes. There was no other place that Rosa loved more or spent more time at, surrounded by the animals that she loved most, and the place where she would have inevitably spent the majority of her life at. They said their goodbyes one last time, with Sissip staring at the small crowd of people curiously from behind his viewing glass, waiting for another opportunity to take another person like Rosa King to their terrifying final affliction. Samantha Kudawet was an exceptional woman. The 43-year-old had spent no less than 20 years as a zookeeper, philanthropist, animal rights activist, and she was one of the leading experts on captive breeding programs in the world. She was employed in New Zealand at Hamilton Zoo as the head curator, but she was often called on from across the globe to give her expert consultations to other facilities, hoping to breed endangered species back to their former numbers. Samantha loved every single creature on Mother Earth, but she did have a special place in her heart for rhinos and tigers especially. Some of the first births on New Zealand soil from both creatures were overseen by Samantha personally. Samantha met her husband Richard at a zoo in 2001, and together they had 2 children. Samantha was as devoted to her kids as she was to the animals, and unsurprisingly, the 2 nature lovers were doing a very good job of raising the next generation of environmental fighters who were every bit as in love with the natural world as their parents were. One of their most famous attractions was a Sumatran tiger named Oz. Oz had been brought in a few years ago to support the breeding program, and he was already the proud father of a pair of cubs sired 2 years before. Samantha had a soft spot for him. For one, he was pivotal to the program, and they planned on him fathering as many cubs as he possibly could with the females they had on site, and he was very enthusiastic about the affair. But Oz was also a reasonably well-mannered and chilled-out fellow, for a tiger anyway, and his docile and relaxed nature made it hard not to charm anyone he came across. He knew and understood humans very well for a feline, and given his long life under human care, he certainly tolerated them much more than the other cats on the compound. That week in 2015, the zoo had visitors from Melbourne, Australia. They'd come to observe New Zealand's management of the larger, more dangerous animals, and also to have a look at their breeding program. If all went well, and the first half of the visit certainly looked like it would, then the 2 would collaborate in the future, especially concerning the breeding of big cats. The team began their morning by going around to feed the animals, and for all of the larger carnivores, the setup was the same. They each had a 3-tiered cage. The smaller enclosure was where the animals were led to at the end of every day to sleep. The second, slightly larger holding was for feeding, And finally, the very biggest one was where they spent their days, in a space where there were plants and branches, sand pits and watering holes, and a big number of toys around for them to play with. Oz and all the rest went into their middle feeding spaces, and when the rounds came by again an hour later, they were let out to their play and display areas, while the Zookeepers came in from behind to clean their sleeping and eating spaces. Every area was securely sectioned off from the next by a heavy snap-lock gate that was impenetrable by an animal once it was shut behind them. Samantha was aware that Oz was not his usual self. September is mating season for Sumatran tigers, and the female in the den next door was starting to show signs of going into heat, and Oz was very much aware of the scents wafting into his enclosure. He'd been pacing nervously up and down his den for weeks. He was unusually agitated and snarled at anyone who walked too close to his fence line. Unfortunately, Oz would have to wait another week or two before he could be allowed in with the female, and hopefully he'd get some of that aggressive energy tapered somewhat by the end of the mating season and return to his usual relaxed self in no time. Samantha, even though she was second in command, was not one to stand back and watch everyone else do the work. She was just as likely to pick up a shovel and haul poop around as the newest hires were. That's one of the reasons that her colleagues had so much respect for her in the first place. She never thought that any kind of work, no matter how hard or menial, was beneath her. Oz ate his breakfast, and when the gate opened to let him out to the large space, Samantha stepped in behind him and closed the gate. Unfortunately, something wasn't right with the gate, and it simply bounced off its snap mechanism and did not shut securely. Samantha turned her back on the gate and went over to her wheelbarrow that was loaded with feed for the red pandas. When she turned the wheelbarrow around to exit through Oz's sleeping place, the tiger was already back inside the feeding area. When he walked through the gate, he heard it slam like it always did. But when he turned around, he caught sight of the gate swinging back open, with Samantha walking away with her back toward him. Oz might have never hunted a day in his life, but that didn't mean that he didn't know what to do then. Even with his belly full of food, his hormonal agitation kicked into high gear. He didn't care to hunt Samantha. To him, at that moment, she was a threat to the female next door, and he needed to protect her at all costs, even if that meant taking out the human that had fed him so consistently all of these years. Oz stepped through the gate, tentatively at first, but once he crossed the threshold with the woman now only a few feet from him, he became an orange blur of lightning. Oz crossed the distance in just 4 massive strides before Samantha turned to face him, her hands still on the handles of the wheelbarrow. Oz jumped over the food in one graceful leap. Samantha's eyes went wide with shock when she saw the predator flying at her through the air. But if she had any plans on screaming out for help, there just was no time for any sound to escape her throat. Oz slammed into her, his paws on her chest and his fangs striking her right in the throat. They went sliding across the ground. The force of that drag shredded through Samantha's shirt and tore the skin on her back to ribbons. Oz didn't wait for them to stop moving before he pulled back, ripping the woman's throat completely out. Samantha was powerless to scream with no windpipe and no voice box left to make any sound. The blood spewing from the gaping wound drenched them both in a shower of red. Oz came down on her neck again, but this time he shook his head fiercely. Samantha's neck was broken by the second shake, and whatever life she had left in her was instantly cut off. The moment that Oz realized that the woman was no longer alive, he stepped back from the body. He wasn't hungry, and the threat had been taken care of. So he paced around the enclosure, unsure of what to do now. He sampled at the body once or twice, mostly out of curiosity, until a pair of zookeepers finally came by. They came across a sight out of a horror movie. Oz's entire face, chest, and front legs were covered in blood. He was so drenched that his orange and black stripes weren't even visible, and a few feet from the upturned wheelbarrow lay the crumpled and bloody mess that was Samantha. Even from that distance, they could see that her throat was ripped out and that there was clear damage to one of her legs. The keepers ran to get help, and in less than 5 minutes after the discovery, Oz was lying unconscious in the play area, the tranquilizer dart sticking out of his rump, proclaiming the cause. Samantha's remains were removed from the scene only after police released the body and had taken all of the evidence they needed. Richard, who also worked at the zoo, had to be physically restrained from running into the enclosure when he heard what had happened. This would be the start of a 2-year lawsuit to determine who was responsible for the death of Samantha. The gate hadn't been maintained properly. A little rust and a lack of regular oil caused the gate to malfunction, and Samantha had gone in alone. It should have been implemented that no zookeeper work alone, no matter what species of animal they were caring for, especially since everyone knew what state Oz had been in the weeks preceding the attack. He hadn't eaten Samantha, proving that he acted out of instinctive territorial behavior. Richard resigned from the zoo the day after the attack. There was just no way that he could bear continuing to work at the place where his wife had died so brutally. But he and the thousands of petitioners all agreed that Oz shouldn't be killed. He was acting according to his nature, and no fault could be placed on the animal for doing what he was born to do. But Hamilton Zoo did not have the proper maintenance schedule in place, nor did they require employees to work in pairs, and both of these factors contributed to Samantha's death. In the end, it was decreed that Hamilton Zoo pay the family $200,000, and they were required to overhaul their entire safety, feeding, and maintenance structure, costing them millions of dollars more to meet the standards that were required to keep the zoo open to the public. One thing is certain, Samantha would have agreed with her husband and the petitioners. Oz had every right to live. No one understood more that every Sumatran tiger on this planet is precious and worth saving. Both Samantha Kudawe and Oz the tiger met their terrifying final afflictions.